Hello. On behalf of NCSL and the Leadership Professional Staff Association, welcome to today's webinar, Beyond the Hashtag, Effective Two-Way Communications with Constituents. A copy of the slides is available on the upper left dashboard, and questions and comments are highly encouraged. You may type them in the audience chat box on the bottom left of the screen. At the end of the presentation, there will be 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A, and at the conclusion of the webinar, there will be a brief survey. Your answers are greatly appreciated. They help us know how many people participated and also allow you to tell us what topics you'd like to see offered in the future. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the NCSL webinar archive. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for the next hour, Larry Schooler.
Thank you very much, Megan. I'm so glad that we found a picture of me that has my hair in the right place, but it's good to be with everybody. Happy Friday, and I hope everybody's getting ready for a nice weekend, maybe a 3-day weekend. By way of quick introduction, I am the father of 2 and the husband of 1. I'm also a public engagement consultant. I do work all over the country. I've done a lot of my work for the city of Austin and now work with partners, as I said, all across the United States on sort of effectively involving those affected by a decision in decisions, in affecting those decisions. So maybe I'll try that again. I enable those affected by a decision to affect those decisions, and feel a great deal of passion about my work. I've served as president of the International Association for Public Participation. So as you can tell, I really geek out on this stuff, and I'm excited to be with you all. I'm going to start with a couple of survey questions that are mainly designed to make sure that I am kind of speaking to the audience that's actually here rather than just making a generic presentation. So you should be seeing here in just a moment the first of a couple of survey questions. And the question, as you can see, is to what extent have you or your office involved your constituents in policy discussions before your elected official has decided how to proceed or vote? So how often have you been able to sort of give the public a say, give your constituents a say in what's being discussed before the decision has been made about how to vote or what bill to file or whether to sponsor a bill? I will tell you as we wait for the answers to come in that, you know, what I hear typically at virtually every level of government is, you know, we may hear from constituents kind of towards the end of the process, but, you know, we often don't hear from them very much you know, when the first discussions of the policy have begun. So we're getting a nice mix of results, kind of a bell curve here from what I can tell. So what I'm seeing here is that it's roughly a third of folks saying that they sometimes involve constituents in policy discussions, with about another third saying seldom or never, and another third saying often or always. So very interesting spread. And we'll give it just another 10 or 15 seconds on this question. So please know there is no right or wrong answer. Obviously, this is a challenging part of our work as public servants to figure out the most effective ways to involve the public in public decisions. And that's really what we're here to talk about, but I wanted to get a feel for how much experience folks have with this. I think we'll go ahead and move to the next survey here in just a minute. That question should be coming up shortly. As you can see, the results of the first survey. So we'll get the second question going here in just a second. Jessica and Megan, I'm not sure if it's visible to the audience yet. It is. Okay. So since your elected official took office, how often have you used technology in any form to try to proactively solicit feedback from the public on policy matters? So since you're elected official, and I know there may be some folks that don't work directly with an elected official, so just fill in whatever your chain of command is, but how often have you used any form of technology to solicit feedback proactively from the public on policy matters? And interestingly, we're seeing a little bit more of a spread here, although it's coming in as also somewhat of a bell curve, with most folks saying occasionally, but quite a few saying frequently, and a few saying frequently, and then about the remaining third saying somewhat seldom. So we'll give it just another couple of seconds, and then we will show you the results. Okay, so we should be popping the results up here in just a moment. And then as soon as we get done with those results, we'll show you the third question that we'd like to get some feedback on. So you're seeing the results there. As I mentioned, a nice mix of comments. I see a comment from Katie Rugg. I don't personally use technology, but I know the LAs, which I assume is legislative assistants, do this somewhat frequently. And that's great to know, Katie. I think, you know, one of the things that's challenging about determining how to deploy technology is, you know, just how tech savvy is our audience, what technologies do they prefer to use, you know, how much do we need to help them with, you know, figuring out how to use the technology. So those are all important questions. Let's go to the last survey, and then we'll get into the content here and talk a little bit more about this. Thanks, Katie. I want to make sure I had that right. I always have to be sure on any acronym I've found in government that you have gotten the right one. So you should, in just a moment, see the third survey question. That should be popping up here very shortly. How often have you or your office hosted a meeting for your constituents to discuss public policy in a format other than a public hearing or a town hall? So you have that sort of, you know, usual thing where folks just have 3 minutes at the microphone and just give speeches one after the other after the other. How often have you done a meeting where you have a format other than that? And I'm noticing on this one, the bulk of folks are saying either once or twice or never. So almost 2/3 of the respondents so far have made that response, and then a smattering have done it a little bit more frequently than that. So we'll keep this up here for just another little bit, and then we'll share those results. All right. So clearly we have a nice conversation. Tom, I apologize for that. I'm seeing your comment there about the question leaving the screen very quickly with little time to respond. Please feel free to add any comments into the chat box if you're not able to fill out the survey. And Jacqueline also didn't get to vote. Sorry, we don't want to disenfranchise anybody here, but maybe we'll come back to the surveys at the end. Sorry about that, but thanks for your comments. Let's go ahead and, if we can, get into the content. So I want to see if you're seeing a slide that says, why doesn't this work? Does that show up for everybody? Jessica and Megan, are you all seeing that? I hope so. So we'll go ahead and go through this. Okay, we're good to go. So when I say why doesn't this work, I'm referring to this. This is an image of kind of what I would call a typical governmental public meeting or public hearing. And, you know, there are a lot of reasons that I think this format for engaging the public is doomed to fail. One, I think, is the setting, and we'll get into that. One is the timing, one is the topic, and one is the players. So I'm going to go through these things one by one, but just want to kind of call your attention for a moment to the way that this room is configured. Maybe notice the time of day, the item on the agenda. You don't know the topic and you don't know the players just by looking at the picture, but we'll talk about that here in just a minute. So when it comes to the setting, as you look at the setting here back on the second slide, you notice that people are sort of sitting in kind of a auditorium style arrangement. And so when I think of that, I think of either what you see on the left, a courtroom, or what you see on the right, a house of worship. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with those two settings. I believe in our justice system, and I'm a person of faith. But when I am in those settings, I'm not really expecting to have much of a participatory role. You know, I'm there to, for example, hear what the verdict is, or I'm there to hear the sermon, or the, you know, the hymns or the choir or whatever. I might sing along, you understand, but it's not meant to be a dialogue. And I like what Robert said. It's such a sterile environment for a public meeting. I mean, it's not necessarily designed for that, and yet we seem to over and over again assume that that's the best space for us to do it in, partly because we're sort of defaulting to this strategy of just posting an item for people to discuss and expecting that anybody who cares enough about it will come to discuss it. But I think that by setting things up in this way, we're creating some inadvertent power dynamics between the speakers and those listening to the speakers. And we're also just, I think, conveying that, this is not meant to be an exchange of information, but more of kind of two people talking past one another, one making speeches and maybe the other not responding, or responding in a very limited way. And I think that's partly to do with the spaces that we're in. I also think there's a big issue around the timing. So as I mentioned, as you saw in the image there, part of the issue was just the time of day. And I suspect if I polled the audience, I would find that a lot of you have been in situations where a legislative hearing has stretched well into the night, perhaps because of the number of speakers, and that may be because that was the only way they felt they could get their voices heard. So part of the question is, the scheduling and the timing, sort of the day of, and how long someone has to wait. I've seen people have to wait 10 hours for virtually 3 minutes of face time with the elected officials. And the how long we get, of course, refers to the 3 minutes that we're often limiting public speakers to, which is out of necessity. I mean, we certainly can't have untimed hearings, or else they would never end, perhaps. But I think the other issue arises based on when the hearing is happening over the lifetime of a project. So you see the project timeline up on the screen. If the hearing is taking place, well after legislation has been drafted, well after meetings have taken place kind of behind the scenes, and we're just really at the point where we're seeing whether this will move forward, that's a tough time for the public to really be able to influence the outcome, as compared to a point much earlier in the process in which we allow the public to kind of have a say in defining the issue, or have a say in defining options for addressing the issue. So there's a timing issue both in terms of time of day, time of wait, time of opportunity to speak, as well as timing over the lifetime of a particular public policy deliberation. Then I think when it comes to the topic, part of our challenge is we sometimes fall back on kind of pardon me for if I'm offending any lawyers on the call, but the legalese associated with some of the policy we're working on, as opposed to thinking about ways in which we can frame the topic so that it not only makes sense to the public, but actually instills within them a sense of urgency. So you see on the slide two contrasting images. One is obviously pretty straightforward, budget hearing, which tends to get in the single digits of attendees. And then on the bottom of the screen, you see a still image from a newscast in which the anchors were framing the budget discussions as a matter of whether or not the parks would have to close in that community. Not all of them, but some of them. So I think in the first one, it's like, well, I don't know why I need to weigh in on the budget per se, but on the second one, I care about the parks that I and my children and my family uses, so I'm going to want to weigh in on that. So I think we have to consider both what we might be legally required to post, by law, but also, in plain English, what's the significance of this conversation? Why are we having it? What are we hoping to accomplish? What do we want the public to understand about the issues that are in front of us? Which can benefit both the audience and the legislators, because sometimes the legislators are beset by people who just simply completely misunderstand what it is that's up for discussion. And if we stated it to them in a lot clearer terms, we would probably find that the attendees to our meetings and the people we engage would have something a little bit more constructive or useful to tell us that would influence how we decide the issue. But in the absence of that, I think we're just expecting people to understand topics that tend to be very dense, very hard to understand, or just very removed from their daily lives. And then I think it's a notion of the people. Now, I don't want to besmirch the reputations of the people who we see at a lot of our public hearings. Some people call them usual suspects. I prefer the term super citizens. But we often see some of the same people over and over. And I think we have to recognize that because we so often make people show up in the middle of the workday to testify, quote unquote, which again brings us back to that connotation of a courtroom, we are really creating kind of a funnel through which people have to fit in order to get their voices heard. So in other words, if they can't, if they don't have the disposable time or the flexibility at their work or whatever to be able to participate, then they just aren't going to necessarily be heard. We also have to consider the fact that we're asking people to get up and make a speech. And while some of us, and I can include myself in this, certainly are comfortable making speeches, that's not something that most of us have to or want to or need to do on a regular basis, either for work or in our personal lives. And we're asking someone to prepare a speech and deliver it on a topic that has some controversy perhaps, not only in front of an audience in the room, but oftentimes in front of a viewing audience on TV and or online. So that's quite a daunting prospect. And so we need to think about how we program our engagement to where we're not just seeing the same super citizens who are ready with a speech on virtually any topic. We need to figure out who isn't in the room that's going to be affected by the policy we're discussing and who needs to be, because they really could end up having an influence beyond the confines of that hearing in ways that's a lot harder for us to manage. And Megan, I see your comment. Showing diversity is so important in the legislature. Constituents are paying more attention to real and equal representation. And I think, a lot of times our legislators may look at the audience of people who have come to testify and think, well, I just don't know what my constituents really think about this. I'm seeing, 6 people who all represent the same point of view, or maybe they're all from the same district or whatever. What do my folks think about this? So in order to go from sort of chaos to collaboration to kind of limited, meetings of limited productivity to something a lot more collaborative and productive, I think we have to get a little shameless. Now, I'm from Austin, so as a citizen of the live music capital of the world, I'm obligated to include at least one slide with a musical reference. So the song Shameless, recorded by Billy Joel on the left and Garth Brooks on the right, has a couple of lyrics that I like to use in presentations like this. They say, I don't have the power now, but I don't want it anyhow, so I gotta let it go. And thought I'd never compromise, oh, but you convinced me otherwise, which of course is the mantra for all married men, but that's another webinar altogether. But looking at I don't have the power now, so I got to let it go, I think what we have to acknowledge, and I think many of us on this webinar probably know this, whether or not we give the public the proverbial bully pulpit or not, they can already bully their way onto the pulpit. By that I mean, if we don't give the folks affected by a decision a meaningful opportunity to affect the decision, they can file a lawsuit. They can put a ballot measure up that could overturn what it is that we've approved. They can stand or sit in the streets and disrupt daily life and tax our public resources in order to, resolve the issue. They can vote the affected legislators out of office or recall them. All of these things have happened. I'm not just being melodramatic. And so it is then therefore incumbent upon us to think about engaging proactively, thoughtfully, inclusively, and fairly. Proactively, in this case, means before something has been decided, before the item is a yay or nay on a bill, but at a point when the public can really influence perhaps what that bill actually looks like. Thoughtfully means we're not going to engage everybody in the same way. What works for a super citizen or a usual suspect is probably not going to work for a working parent. And the same goes for inclusion. Some folks may only feel comfortable engaging in a language other than English. Some folks may not be able to go very far from their home, but still would like to have their voice heard. And in terms of fairness, we all know that some interests have greater access to our elected officials than others. And it's not for us to try to stop lobbyists or to stop lobbying or to, in some way undermine the First Amendment right to free speech and assembly and so on. But I think we have to consider that not everybody has the resources to engage in those ways, and we need to try to level the playing field with our engagement processes. And thought I'd never compromise, oh, but you convinced me otherwise. Part of my background is in mediation and conflict resolution, and what I have typically found is that we often see citizens taking these entrenched positions. You're either for something or against it, and they see no room for any sort of consensus to emerge out of that. And they develop sort of a monolithic impression of the other side. Well, those people, they don't want what's best for the state or whatever. Having a more well-convened process of dialogue, ongoing dialogue, will, I think, based on my experience doing this work, produce some possible collaboration, even from some strange bedfellows, and some win-win solutions based on underlying interests. So, for example, if you have folks either for or against a measure related to public school finance, their underlying interests might actually be similar. So the business community might really want to have high-skilled graduates as much as parents groups or teachers groups do. So it's important to understand what motivates people in the positions that they're taking before you necessarily get to a place of trying to decide between one of two positions. You're looking for a solution that will satisfy as much and as many of the underlying interests as possible. So what this takes, in my mind, is a change in our viewpoints, a change in paradigm. We need to go from thinking about our constituents as customers of government and more thinking about them as citizens who have a directly active role in co-creating the future of our states. And of course, I mean this not in an immigration context, but in the context of simply somebody who, really is engaged and participatory and isn't going to expect others to make all the changes that need to be made, but have some role in carrying those out. But it also requires something on the part of those who work for elected officials and the elected officials themselves. They need to understand not just the importance of listening to their own conscience or maybe to the higher power of their choosing, but also listening out to voices that may differ from their own positions. Democrats listening to business leaders, or Republicans listening to environmentalists. I mean, I'm stereotyping there, but I think the point is we need to look to voices that are different than the ones that we ourselves typically hear in our minds, and also be open to ideas other than the ones that they may have run on or the ones that they may have been pushed to support on the campaign trail. And similarly, the folks sort of working more behind the scenes on the policy need that same kind of open-mindedness and focus more on controlling a process by which we get to a final outcome rather than the actual outcome itself. So the staff can still recommend a particular policy direction, but they at least should open themselves up to various possibilities emerging from the public conversation so as to create the best possible outcome, which gets to kind of the pros and cons of doing things this way. I think it's obvious that the more time we spend on public engagement and dialogue with the public, we certainly could elongate the decision-making process, and it could cost some more money and be a little bit more complicated than simply posting a bill for hearing, having it go through committee, and then over to the full legislature. But my experience has suggested, and there's been some research to back this up, that we end up with decisions that are more credible and durable and creative and legitimate. And the significance of that is that, if you think of going to the emergency room versus going to your primary care doctor, the emergency room may seem like the quicker fix, but it often is a lot more expensive, and you could end up waiting for many hours to be seen for just a couple of minutes by the doctor. Whereas in the preventative case, you may need to see the doctor several times over many years, but in the long run, that's going to pay off in terms of outcomes. I think the same can be said for public policy in a way, because even if it takes longer on the front end to work through the different issues with the various stakeholders, the chances of it getting bogged down later on or facing some of the fates that we talked about earlier, lawsuit, recall, et cetera, referendum, the chances of that are much less. So it's worth investing more time and effort in the front end to get a better outcome and a speedier implementation on the back end. So I think in order to do this well, we have to think in terms of some guiding principles. And what you're seeing come up on the screen are some themes from public participation and engagement principles that I have found all over the world. And I think most of them are pretty straightforward, and we've kind of talked about several of them. I think one of the things that's really important is for people to understand when they're going to get to engage so that they don't engage just out of fear or out of a feeling that if they don't raise their voices really loudly, then things will not go their way. We also, again, have to be mindful of making the information accessible. So when I talk about accessibility, of course, we partly need to think of our citizens and constituents who have challenges with mobility and other disabilities, but we also need to think about just explaining things to people in terms that they can really understand so that their input is both useful to us and connected to the issues that we're really talking about. Just in the same vein, there is an organization that I mentioned called the International Association for Public Participation, who lays out a set of guiding principles, and this is available on their website. But I think, one of the things that is a little bit elusive sometimes in the work that we do is fulfilling the promise that the public's contribution will influence the decision. So it's one thing to create a participatory opportunity like a hearing, but if the reality is that our bosses' minds are already made up and there's very little that can be done to change that, then we're really creating a scenario in which trust in our office holders and in our legislatures will be undermined and diminished. So we've got to figure out an opportunity for the public to participate that will allow them to influence the decision, and then just as importantly, communicate to them at the end how their input affected the decision. So we might have a left-hand column that says, here's what the public told us, kind of the big themes, a middle column that says, here's what we thought of it, and the right-hand column with what we intend to do about it. So that doesn't require us to do everything the public tells us, but it does allow the public to see that we were listening, that we took their input into account, and perhaps in cases where we didn't incorporate it, here's why, and here's what can be done, or in cases that we did incorporate it, here's how that came to pass. Again, we also have to consider that not every public policy decision will be the same, and no two are really the same. So in this graphic here describing a spectrum, you can see that on the left-hand side, we're really not doing a whole lot to involve the public other than making sure they know what's going on. So think of public safety disasters and the like, where we wouldn't necessarily have tons of public meetings, but we do want people to know how to get resources, how to get their power back, and so on. On the empower end of the scale, on the right-hand side, that tends to be a measure going before the voters on a ballot that might take money out of their pocket, a tax increase of some kind, or a major change to our Constitution, which is sort of the foundational defining documents in our legislatures, in our states. Most often, we're going to fall somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. And I would argue that as much as this illustrates the public having an increasing impact on the decision as you move left to right, from inform to empower, I would argue that you also could think of it in terms of, as the decision has more impact on the public, perhaps the public should have more of an impact on the decision. So, of course, if a hurricane is coming for somebody's house, that's a major impact on their daily life, and we might only be at an informed level of the spectrum. But when it comes to changing our Constitution, or increasing our taxes, or just doing something that feels very fundamental to our state's identity that we're inclined to put onto a ballot, that's something that I think the public expects to have more of an impact on, partly because of the impact they perceive it to be having on themselves. I see Marianne's question about whether it'll be available for later viewing, and I do believe it will archive, and Marianne, the slides are available as well, and I'm happy to follow up with you later on. This is just the bottom half of the spectrum graphic that gives you some helpful language to think about in terms of the different levels of participation, and I encourage you to take a look at that offline. So then, once we have our guiding principles, we have to think about why we specifically are engaging. What do we want to accomplish? What do we want the public to tell us, and what do we want to do with the information? So there's all kinds of different reasons to engage. It could be legally mandated. We want to get a diverse cross-section of the public interests. We want to generate new solutions. We want to limit delays, mistakes, and lawsuits. Now, that may not be public messaging, but that could be the reality that we are really trying to make sure we get this right and don't squander away precious public resources. But we need to understand why we're engaging in general in terms of an overall process, and also why we're doing a particular form of engagement, which we'll get into here in just a second. But just as important is knowing what we want to accomplish, which is to say, what do we want to hear from the public, which will then have a positive impact on the policy that we're working on or the budget that we're preparing. What will we do with that information? Those are questions we have to answer before we even decide what kind of meetings or other tools we're going to use. So let's look at a couple of examples. This is a public meeting that I worked on for the city of Austin during a potential bond referendum. In the photo, which I'm sure is hard to parse a little bit, so I'll describe it to you, you'll see some easels and stations around the room set up kind of like an open house, but rather than just doing an open house and having people just browse for a few minutes and leave, they then were seated at tables to which they were assigned with their name tag having a numeral on it, like the wedding reception, giving you your table assignment. And they were given $400 million and asked as a group to decide how to spend that money on various projects that were eligible for bond funding. We then totaled all of these game results, and that's what eventually the public got to see on the ballot, and nearly all of the measures passed very handily. One of them passed the year following. So it's not just a matter of games for the sake of making things fun. It's a game-like activity that actually allows the government to get the input that they need in order to parse the difficult spending choices that they have to make. And in the case of a bond, it also built some community support because people could see that this was in fact a bond referendum that reflected what they really wanted to see get done. So we had facilitators to help people at each of the tables. We had a good mix of perspectives at each table. and this really produced, I think, a win-win outcome for the public and the government agency. We also need to think about engaging the unengaged, and this graphic is from something that we've called Speak Week. Sorry for having to look at another picture of my face, but the concept here is to have a presence either at special events with high foot traffic or just areas of your district or state that have high foot traffic, and to enable people to share some input on the go. So this was a display for mobility questions with magnets for different modes of transportation that people could move around to tell us how they wanted us to prioritize transportation improvements. So it's convenient, it's safe, it's anonymous, it's for people that don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time on a speech, but they would like to give you some quick input with the limited time they have. Now, one of the ways to deal with the fact that most people won't come to public meetings throughout the course of their lifetime is to package up the meetings into boxes. And the images you see on the screen are, one is from a sort of a planning effort, and one is from the budget, in which people could take these boxes, check them out at libraries, or print the files out as a PDF, and take them to either their homeowners association, their scout troop, their book club, their knitting circle, whatever setting, and have the meetings whenever they wanted, and very easily convey the input back to the government agency. So again, convenient, flexible, and a little safer, and a little chance of being more honest, because you're potentially with people you either already know or you're affiliated with in some way. So it's different than having to go just to a random public meeting with folks that you aren't familiar with yet. Then we've started something called Conversation Corps, in which we've trained community volunteers to take discussion guides and go out to cafes, to theater spaces, to businesses, to workplaces, anywhere they would like to host a conversation, and host a smaller group talking about a particular topic that an agency wants them to collect feedback on. So by virtue of living in all parts of a district or a community, you're able to get a broader cross-section of viewpoints just by virtue of positioning the conversations all across an area. When it comes to spending decisions, we are frequently challenged by our constituents to sort of do everything and spend nothing, hit all of their priorities without touching their taxes. So I think it's incumbent upon us to think about ways in which we can leverage technology to make the spending decisions clearer and ask the public to help us make those tough spending choices. This is a screenshot from a website called Balancing Act, which allows people to take a closer look at spending plans, better understand them in layperson's terms, and then work through the difficult choices and decide, is something worth funding more in exchange for a tax increase, or am I willing to cut something else to make up for what I'm asking for greater funding for? So it could be very helpful in terms of providing some political cover when there are circumstances when an elected official wants to support a tax increase or revenue increase for a particular project. I want to take a moment to spotlight a little bit of a more out-of-the-box technique where we use the government access television stations that many of our legislatures have access to televise a conversation with the public and leverage text messaging, social media, and telephone technology. So I think it's important when we talk about technology to make sure that we are not limiting ourselves just to the internet. The internet, of course, is becoming more and more ubiquitous, but still at least a fourth of the population doesn't have a reliable high-speed internet access in their home or any internet access at all. And so even though a lot of people have internet access, it's important for us to consider that some people, particularly older folks who have a hard time getting out of their home, would be more likely to participate by phone or by television. And younger folks, I've had young interns, pre-college, tell me that they do everything over text and virtually nothing over email or web. So this clip that I'm about to show you from a community conversation about recycling and composting leveraged these different tools in the same meeting, and I'll share with you after the clip how this paid off in terms of overall engagement. So Jessica and Megan, whenever you're ready, we can play the video clip.
Unsure. So on the phone, we're seeing a discrepancy in favor of those not willing to pay that extra $3. In a moment, we'll see some results from texting and from Twitter that'll show us what they're saying. And as you can see, it's a higher number. Our guess is that the folks who are texting and tweeting are the ones who are calling us tonight, who are calling in whereas the folks on the phone are chiefly those who have been called, have gotten one of our randomly chosen numbers in the Austin area to take a call. So that kind of explains that. All right. So again, if you'd like to join us and make some comments or questions at this point, let me tell you, you can call us at 800-400-1932. You can also participate in Spanish at 888-400-9342. I'm going to look through my list of comments and questions that I've got here from the folks on the phone, and I see a comment from Frances, and I would love to be able to bring Frances on air to share her comment. So we'll wait just a moment, and we should be able to hear Frances's comment. Frances, if you can hear me, please go ahead.
Are you talking about me being on the phone?
Yes, ma'am. You're on the air. Go ahead and share your comment.
Okay. I feel that twice a month is fine if you have a large can. But if your can is smaller, then you need to have it done every week.
And when you say
We
can,
have a large can, and 2 weeks is fine.
you have a large can and 2 weeks is fine. I see. So how does that compare to some other anecdotal experiences, gentlemen?
So just to kind of explain a little bit more of what you were seeing there, folks were commenting on whether or not we should increase the frequency of recycling pickup and whether we should offer composting service at the curb. And they were able to either call in or participate via text message or tweet us at a particular @ symbol. So, you know, when I talked about beyond the hashtag, I certainly don't mean without the hashtag. I think there's certainly a need to leverage the incredible audiences we have on social media. But I've designed things in this particular way because I didn't want anyone to be excluded. And again, we have a variety of different audiences who wouldn't choose between showing up at a meeting or online. They would choose neither for a variety of reasons. Could be privacy, could be unfamiliarity or discomfort with the technology, and so on. But I mean, I think here's the key. When we had some public meetings on this topic, just typical public meetings, we might have gotten 25 people at each of 2 or 3 meetings. When we did this for the televised town hall meeting, you can see we had nearly 4,000 people on the phone with 83 speakers and as many as 1,000 or so on the phone at one time, or dialed in or connected to us at one time. So what you're getting out of that, obviously, is a situation of getting a much broader cross-section of your public than you would otherwise get just by saying, y'all come to the meeting, and reaching audiences that might be especially hard to reach, like Spanish speakers. So, you know, that's a situation where in this particular platform, folks were able to hear the entire meeting simulcast in Spanish, and were thereby able to convey their comments in Spanish and have me read them out in English. And, you know, with topics that concern your entire state or your entire district, you know, you've really got to figure out, you know, what am I going to do to connect with people, not necessarily who don't speak any English, but people who for whom English is not their most comfortable language to discuss complex topics like this. I'm just going to run through a couple of other tools that I think are relevant to consider. One is kind of thinking beyond the typical multiple choice or open-ended survey model to something more sophisticated. This is from a company called MetroQuest, which I really like because they have a variety of different ways of presenting survey questions. This is a transportation survey where you can see how a particular transportation alternative aligns with the priorities that you chose in a previous question on the survey, a drop and drag prioritization exercise. So it really liberates the sponsoring agency who's collecting input to go beyond just text, multiple choice, and open-ended questions to get something that's a little more easy to understand with visual aids. Then I think there's a need to, that was Mark Howick, that was MetroQuest is the name of the company that does the survey. I'll type that in the chat box. Then there's a sort of a trend to enable people not just to read agendas online, which is certainly something I'm sure many of your agencies do, but also to allow people to comment directly. And I think, as we said earlier, rather than expecting someone to travel a great distance to participate when it's a statewide issue, or to wait around for hours to speak for a couple of minutes, if they could comment online, they typically would have just as much of a meaningful chance to share their views, and then the legislature can call up and see, how a particular item is trending. So they can click on the item and see the comments, as well as how many folks are saying they're for or against or neutral on that topic. So again, diversifying the sources of input. One thing I want to really stress, though, is that leveraging technology should be more than just for asking people to pick from a set of alternatives, but to actually try to mimic some of the meetings you would have in person online through the use of threaded discussion. So you're seeing some screenshots from a site I helped with called Speak Up Austin. There are a number of these around the country now. We were not the first, and we certainly aren't the last. But the concept here is, rather than just having a survey, you're putting some content out, and you're asking people to respond to it with a moderator. The same way I would facilitate a public meeting, I moderate the discussions on the website, not just looking for, profanity or something, but to kind of help understand the points people are making and to try to connect disparate points of view at the same time. Now, of course, you still can do surveys on a site like this, but I think the key is to do more than that, to really challenge people not just to have preferences, but to share what concerns them about the topic, what we should consider, and go beyond just picking A, B, C, D, or E. And more importantly, do so in an interactive way with their fellow citizens and in a public fashion. Surveys are obviously private. They are sent directly to a source, and we don't ever really see what those results are except in aggregate. The discussion forum is transparent. Everybody can see it. Everybody can be a part of it. And it really challenges us to think not just about what I believe, but how I would respond to the concerns raised by other people who think about this differently than I do. So the website from these screenshots is speakupaustin.org. But again, many cities and communities all over the country are, and over the world for that matter, are leveraging technology in this way. A couple of others, I think there are signs of folks putting the draft versions of legislation up on a site like a wiki space, which would allow people to make comments directly on the piece of legislation. There's another site that I'm going to put into the chat window called publiccomment.com, which does a similar thing. There's also Civic Comment, which it has a similar purpose. So just kind of for the people that really want to get into the nitty-gritty, this is an emerging trend. And then a lot of times, particularly at the local level, but I would think that this would be pertinent also at the state level, we want to give people's feedback on something that involves spatial relations, like how to deal with mobility issues around the state, or how to plan a big piece of land, for example. And so this site, which is called CrowdBright, and I'm putting that in the chat window, is a much more visually compelling interface, and it doesn't just have to be used by someone sitting at their computer or their tablet or their phone, but it can be incorporated into a live meeting so that as people are making comments, they're getting collected in a way that everybody can see and sort of notice how their comment is trending or how people are reacting to it in real time. So this is another image from that site. Again, it's called CrowdBright. So I'm just going to close with a couple of slides that I think should give you a sense of where you should go with this work from here. I think there are key questions that everybody listening to this ought to be thinking through around values, policy, process, their toolkit, and their training. When it comes to values, I think we need to ask ourselves what we really mean when we say public engagement. Why does it matter to either our elected official or our agency? What do we expect, when we engage the public? What are we trying to get? And what are we committed to? Are we committed to a certain amount of notice for opportunities to engage? Are we committed to engaging at the very beginning of a policy-making process? Are we committed to making it easier for parents with children to participate by providing children's activities at our meetings? What are we willing to commit to? In the way of policy, kind of in a similar spirit, what do we need to be consistent about every time we have an engagement? Do we need to make sure we have posted agendas? Do we need to make sure we have ground rules? Do we need to provide interpreters in other languages? What should be consistent from one engagement to the next? Because, of course, the public doesn't know whether it's such and such representative or such and such senator or such and such state agency. They just know it's the state. So they want to know that from process to process it'll be consistent. When it comes to process, I think it's important to think beyond just having one meeting, a particular meeting or a particular survey, and thinking more in terms of a multi-step process. So at the beginning, we might be trying to get people's general ideas, but towards the end, we might be asking them to, pick from a couple of competing ideas. But going back to the spectrum, what are we trying to achieve? Do we want to eventually give the public final say over the decision? Do we want to consult with them on some defined alternatives? Who do we really need to reach? Which folks have a deep-seated stake in this? What do we specifically want to know from them? And what kind of questions do we want to ask? And then when it comes to the toolkit, this refers to kind of the strategies we're going to use for engagement, and I think we still have to ask similar questions. If we're trying to reach a teenage audience, we're going to use a completely different set of tools than an audience of senior citizens. Or a group of people in one part of the state versus another might react completely differently depending on the style of engagement that we use. And specifically, what do we want to know? I think if we just ask for any comments or public comment, we're asking for a lot of stuff that's not really going to be that useful to us. We've got to be as specific and as compelling as we can be with those questions, really putting the public inside of our minds to understand what we're wrestling with and asking them to help us come to consensus with it. And then when it comes to training, I think that there are a lot of ways for you and others that you work with, and even your elected officials, to improve their public engagement through a variety of forms of training. I do think that training around just listening is important, because some of us are listening with an ear towards what we're going to say in response rather than fully listening to what someone is saying and being prepared to change our reaction. Public speaking, I think, is something that may seem like a given in the work that we do, but there's some different things to emphasize when you're speaking at a public meeting, responding in a public meeting, that I think are useful to understand. Facilitation and mediation are related but different skills that I'm sure you've seen or have taken courses on, that are both designed to allow you as public servants to help ensure a productive and successful meeting. And then in that same vein, courses on meeting design, process design are both going to be helpful, because, again, this is not putting a microphone in the middle of the room and seeing what happens. This is something a lot more deliberately done in order for it to work. And then technology and engagement. I mean, I've just barely scratched the surface given the limited time that we have today to talk about the ways in which technology can benefit the work that you're doing on public engagement. So I encourage you to seek these out, and if you're interested in specific courses, you can certainly follow up with me, and you can do so in the ways that you see up on the screen. So I do want to thank you all for the attention you've given me. I do know I was talking a little bit fast. It was because I wanted to make sure I got through all of this content and left time for questions or comments, for that matter. So I think I've done that, but I know I've talked quickly, so I'm happy to clarify things or speak to other aspects of the topic or hear your comments and responses. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes for any questions or comments. Just a reminder to type them into the audience chat on the bottom left of your screen if you have any. In the meantime, as we're waiting to see if there's any questions, I have a question, Larry. I'm wondering if you have any quick tips or ideas for people who may find themselves unexpectedly dealing with a hostile constituent or participant when they set up these types of meetings.
Great question. Yeah, that's a great question. And I do see a couple of questions from William and Tammy that I'll get to in just a moment, and you're welcome, Megan. Yeah, I mean, I sometimes show a video that takes clips from some of the congressional, quote-unquote, town hall meetings that we've all seen, at various points in our careers on healthcare and otherwise, and we certainly see some of that hostility come through. I always try to lead with empathy, and what I mean by that is, as much as I may be feeling uneasy or uncomfortable, I try to start with something very basic. Ma'am or sir, I can tell you're really concerned about this topic. I can see you're upset. I can see that this issue has a great deal of personal meaning for you. I can see this is really important to you. I can see you have a lot of passion on this topic. I'm here to do what I can to address your concerns, and if I'm not able to do that adequately, I want to give you some other ways that you can, connect with my office to talk about that. I also counsel people to, you're very welcome, Mark. I also counsel people to, be honest. So if you're truly in an uncomfortable situation and just are in that sort of fight, flight, freeze kind of decision matrix, there's nothing wrong with saying, I'm sorry, I'm feeling a little uncomfortable. If we can maybe go sit down or talk after the meeting, that would be, potentially better. That's more for a one-on-one kind of setting than perhaps a large group. But in a large group setting, I think that the most important thing is for people to feel heard. And one way to make them feel heard is by both empathizing with them and then paraphrasing what it is that you heard them say and making sure you've captured it accurately, usually with a visible notepad or a computer screen that's taking notes, so that you can make sure they know that they're going to be responded to either that night, that day, or at some point down the road. So it's a very important question, and I wish I could do a whole webinar just on that, because certainly we've seen lots of meetings like this devolve in that way. But to be honest, I think that as important as techniques like that are, it's just as, if not more important, to design the meetings in such a way that we reduce the chances of that happening. And one of the ways that I do that is by leaning heavily on small group breakouts, because I find that many people are more comfortable participating with 7 or 8 or 10 people than they would be with quite a larger audience. Let me try to get through these in the sequence they came in. So I'll start with William. He says, what do you believe is the best method to engage constituents, and how often should it be conducted? Please take into account limited staff and resources. That's a great question, William. And personally, I just, it's going to sound like I'm getting a kickback from the television industry, and I'm not. But I really like the possibility of, even if it's going to be something fairly low intensity like a Facebook Live, which I think has its limitations but also its benefits, a way for people to interact in real time with that elected official or that public administrator and participate via a variety of means. It doesn't have to be very expensive. It does not have to involve a lot of staff. It's the kind of thing that can easily reach a large audience in a short period of time. I think one of the challenges with a lot of our online engagement is that it almost depends upon spending multiple weeks to kind of get the numbers that you hope to get to sort of represent the district or the community. So for me, I personally think that we should be spending a lot more of our attention on leveraging an asset that we're, I think, underutilizing in reality. Tammy asks, and thank you for the question, Tammy asks, how many participants attended the bond referendum? Was there a good representation of the community? Tammy, that's a great question. So first of all, we held that same meeting in 4 different locations. So when it was all said and done, I know we had a couple of hundred people at the face-to-face meetings, but then we gave them other tools to engage, including, I believe, a meeting in a box and an online version of that tabletop exercise. So ultimately, we did have good representation from the community. We asked for demographic information and got it, and that way we were able to tell the city council and the other decision makers that we really had gotten a good cross-section of the public. But I think if we had just done it as an in-person event like that, we probably would have not been able to get that same kind of reaction. John asks, do you do anything to try to screen comment threads, for example, for genuine members of the public versus lobbyists or special interests? Very interesting question, John. I would say that in general, as a moderator, I'm just always in the curiosity mode. So I'm not necessarily going to ask them either offline or online if there are lobbyists or special interests, but I try to probe to understand more of where they're coming from, so as to, just tease out what's of significance to them. And that might be them sharing that they are, in fact, advocating for a particular organization, which, of course, is their right. I know that, elected officials may want to distinguish between the two. But for me, I might say, help me understand where you're coming from on this topic. What is it about this topic that got you interested? What's been your experience directly with the topic? Again, not specifically to do that screening per se, but just to, again, help figure out where their motivations lie. Thank you for that question. David, what are the most common mistakes you see with offices that can easily be fixed? And also, what's possible with community engagement during a campaign? How can a candidate engage with an area or district? Or what are humble ways to do so without being the elected official already? David, I love that question about campaigns. It's something that I really would like to explore more with candidates, because I think the more candidates who can actively involve potential voters in crafting their platform, the better off they would be, the better off the district would be. And so I'm hopeful that we will start to see candidates for office having open-ended conversations with their communities, both about what the priority issues are and maybe what some of their suggestions are for addressing them, and do it early enough in a campaign cycle that they can then have influence over their, stump speech or their, platform or their website or whatever they're going to, forcefully take to the voters at election time. You asked about what are some of the most common mistakes. I think one big mistake is asking the decision maker to also be the facilitator. What I mean by that is a facilitator is there to be objective and neutral and make sure that the meeting is successful, that people feel that they are able to get their voices heard, that they really are, that everyone's voice is being heard, not just the people that might agree with the legislator or the person leading the meeting. And so that's a different role than the decision maker. The decision maker isn't neutral usually. They have a point of view. Now, they may be open-minded about exactly how to see their point of view come about, but ultimately they're going to be making a decision where the facilitator isn't. And so I highly recommend that even if it's a staff person who can be neutral, or maybe another legislator or a journalist or a professional facilitator, that offices use outside, a third party of some kind. It can be someone internal to the organization, but a third party who's there to make sure the meeting is a success, so that the elected official can be liberated to be both a listener and a participant, for that matter, in the conversation. Roxanne, a great question. You talked a bit about inclusion and diversity, but I often find that this can be a phrase with little to back it. How do we ensure that we truly hear from diverse opinions and actively reach out to others to include their viewpoints? So for me, Roxanne, this starts with an aggressive mapping of my district, not by streets and highways, but by communities, by organizations and communities of interest and churches and big employers and chambers of commerce and environmental groups and neighborhood groups, and then tailoring my engagement to fit what those folks do. So, for example, if I'm engaging with an African American church, I might be trying to work with that pastor to incorporate something into a sermon or a bulletin or a Sunday school class as a way of engaging folks at church. Maybe not right in the middle of services, but at a point where they're a captive audience and they're willing to be reached in that context. It's a highly trustworthy source of information, and so folks are going to sort of sit up and listen when they're hearing from an important voice in their community. Hispanic and Asian American communities very much have religious communities as well, but they may be reached by other community organizations or cultural groups, or they may be reached beyond their ethnicity in ways that are just a function of parts of town, parts of the district, and so on. So I think it's about having engagement taking place where people are, both in terms of organizations they're a part of, but also in terms of where they live and work and are. And I think it's also about having a variety of different people to convey the engagement opportunity, because I'm going to more readily open an email from my rabbi, for example, than I might from my legislator, because my legislator, is probably sending me a form letter. My rabbi is sending me something that is, a little bit more personal or a little bit more directly related to my life. So I think it's important not just to be sending out communications from that elected official, but think how else can I get this message out there? Because with limited resources, we're not exactly going to bust the budget on advertising, but we certainly could find ways to get the message into more inboxes that would be open with more messengers to use. And Lisa asked, where can I find more information about designing a meeting in a box? I guess the best thing I would tell you is to reach out to me. There's not kind of a one-stop shop that I know of for meetings in a box. I'm certainly happy to talk to you about what I've done in the past. You can certainly Google meeting in a box and see whether some of the work in Austin and Fort Lauderdale and some of the other places that I've worked on it or seen it done could be described. But I'm happy if you just want to contact me to just go in depth with you on it and give you more information on that. So let's see, I think looking through here, and Jessica and Megan, I think that I've gotten everybody's question that posted a question. I know I had a question earlier about one of the companies, and so I put that into the chat box. everything else was just related to the beginning of the call. So Lisa would love to hear from you. Aaron, you're very welcome. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, so I'm happy to stand by for another minute or so to see if there's other questions, and also be reached, after we're through here. But I do want to, before I close, just thank you all, because not only were you attentive and part of this today and made it worth my while, but I've been a proud resident of 4 different states in my lifetime, and I know the importance of state government, both as a reporter in my first career and now in the work that I do. And I just really appreciate it. I know that state government often gets, state government employees are often underpaid, even more so than other government employees, and state government often feels a little bit remote for folks as compared to local government. And everyone on this call knows that it is perhaps as integral to our daily quality of life as anything. So thank you for making our states so wonderful, and please continue to keep up the good work, not just in public engagement, but in general. So Megan and Jessica, I'm happy to stop there, or I can stand by. But thank you all very much.
Yeah, I think we can finish up. Thank you very much, Larry. Really appreciate it. A few final reminders. The webinar will be available on the NCSL webinar archive by next week. If you have any further questions or comments, feel free to contact Larry, or you can contact me at megan.mccluer@ncsl.org. And if you would, please take a couple minutes to fill out the survey that's about to pop up on your screen. And thank you from all of us here at NCSL, and have a wonderful rest of your day.